Good morning, everyone. My name is Garrett Monroe. I'm the Southside Director here at Calder. I am joined with Chris George, an M&A attorney at Varnum in their M&A practice. Today's goal is to specifically talk about sell-side clients and how M&A attorneys might play a role in a sell-side transaction. And we're lucky enough to have Chris join us this morning. And maybe, Chris, if you could give us a little background on yourself and a little bit about Varnum, and then we'll jump into a few questions that I think will be helpful for sellers to hear about.
Absolutely. Well, first off, appreciate you having me. Glad to be here. It's always good to talk to other advisors, especially ones that we have good working relationships with, like we do with Calder. And just in terms of background for those of the viewers that are not familiar with Varnum, Varnum's a full-service law firm headquartered here in Grand Rapids, offices throughout the state of Michigan as well as Naples, Florida. One of our strong practices is our M&A group, of which I'm a member and have been for going on 8 years now. So came up as a corporate associate in the group, doing 100% corporate work, probably 70 to 75% M&A, which is about the mix that I have now. So the majority of my time is spent advising clients both on the buy side and the sell side going through the M&A process.
That's great. Yeah, and like Chris said, Calder's done a lot of work with Varnum. I've done personally a lot of work with Chris, and the three questions that I tried to craft are a little bit more about once you're in the thick of a transaction, you're maybe engaged with a letter of intent with a buyer. What are some things that you should start thinking about as it relates to the legal process, but specifically the purchase agreement? But one thing that we run into, and this is kind of the first question, is we run into a lot of sellers that either have attorneys already, long-term relationships, family, friends. Chris, why should a business seller hire a M&A attorney that's specifically focused on M&A transactions? I don't know if full-time is the right way to put it, but they're geared and specialized in M&A transactions.
Absolutely, and that's something that we often, like you alluded to, run into when we're engaged to advise on a sell-side transaction. Our first and foremost, our approach is that we view longtime corporate counsel that might be a different firm as folks that we can tap into as a resource. And so we always try to make clear up front that, our goal is to not duplicate efforts. And so as we go through, for instance, a diligence process, a longtime corporate counsel will be more intimately familiar with the business, with the client, if we've just been engaged to handle the transaction side of things. So we try to leverage them throughout the deal process and lean on them and their historical institutional knowledge. But think that we also can provide a good amount of value add in terms of the transaction specifically. And so, for instance, there are specific terms that we can more quickly negotiate either at the LOI stage or in a purchase agreement because we've seen hundreds and hundreds of iterations of how those types of provisions are negotiated in similar transactions. And so, we often find it very difficult when we're on the other side of a deal where the other party only has their longtime corporate counsel or family friend, find it very difficult to negotiate because, they'll push buttons that, they'll press on issues that maybe aren't super material in the grand scheme of things. And so, a lot of times the assumption is like you would rather have a law firm on the other side that isn't super experienced, but I actually have very much found it to be the opposite, and that I prefer to have a firm that's got a long history of doing M&A work, a lot of experience, because we can more quickly narrow down the issues that really matter to both sides. And while they may more aggressively negotiate or be more sophisticated in their thought process, at least we're kind of singing off the same song sheet, and it eliminates the surprises. And so to make your life easier as a sell-side advisor trying to get your client to a closing, I would think about it that way, right? You want to have a law firm that's advising your client on a sell-side transaction that knows exactly how to dial into the 3 or 4 things that are really going to be key issues in a deal, as opposed to kind of derailing the process and maybe focusing on things that in the context of an M&A transaction, aren't the top button issues or the things that will lead to lingering risk for a sell-side client.
Well said. This kind of actually nicely goes into the second question, because I think a lot of attorneys that are not familiar with M&A transactions tend to get slipped up on the reps and warranties within the purchase agreement.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to cover that topic. So why are reps and warranties important to a seller in a purchase agreement? And in your experience, which ones are most commonly disputed?
Absolutely. So sellers are very keenly impacted by reps and warranties in the purchase agreement because, to put it very simply, it is the state of affairs that a seller is giving the buyer as to the business that they're selling. So a buyer will obviously want those reps and warranties to be as expansive as possible. So they're going to want statements that the seller is making about historical performance of the business, current state of affairs, as well as forward-looking statements. And the risk for sellers, and why on the sell side we want the scope of those reps and warranties to be as narrow as possible, is because if one of those reps and warranties that a seller is making is false, or if a rep calls for a seller to list all of the contracts to which it's a party, and a seller fails to list one of those contracts, a buyer then has the ability to, under the purchase agreement, make a claim post-closing against the seller for any damages that it suffers as a result of that seller's breach. So on the sell side, we want those to be the scope of those reps and warranties to be as narrow as possible. So we understand, again, going back to your first point about, kind of market terms, we wouldn't be able to have an as is, where is transaction for an M&A deal. So we understand that a buyer is going to have the comfort it needs to close, going to need a fulsome scope of reps and warranties depending on the size and industry of the client being sold. And so, we try to limit those with things like knowledge qualifiers. So, on the sell side, we wouldn't advise a client to make a representation that there are no threatened litigations anywhere in the world that may arise post-closing relating to their business. That would be an impossible statement for them to make. So we do things like add a knowledge qualifier that say, to seller's knowledge, there's no pending or threatened litigation. And so we try to limit our clients' exposure on the sell side by narrowing not just the length of the 15 or 20 pages of reps and warranties, but also the scope of them in terms of adding things like knowledge qualifiers, adding materiality qualifiers, so that, obviously at some point the diligence process has to come to an end and we need to get to a closing. And so, having a seller list only its material contracts and not every single copy or lease or NDA that it's signed since the dawn of time is a way to reduce the disclosure burden on the part of our clients and also get a transaction to a closing. So that's kind of a broad view of how I approach reps and warranties on the sell side. Your question about which of those are most highly negotiated, it's typically those types of reps and warranties that are most likely to lead to a potential claim post-closing. So a buyer is going to want really fulsome reps and warranties on things that it cannot do independent diligence on. So it has some source of recourse if the state of business for the client is not in the manner that it's being represented. And so that's a totally fair position for a buyer to take conceptually, but at some point a seller has to sleep at night knowing that they've disclosed everything that they know about the business and that they're not going to be subject to a claim post-closing that comes out of the woodwork for something they're not anticipating. So for instance, a buyer will often ask for a rep from a seller stating that all of the accounts receivable of the business are collectible, period. Obviously, if post-closing there's some AR that exists at the closing that the buyer's not able to collect, seller didn't disclose that at closing, they wouldn't be able to, there'd be no way for them to know that was going to play out that way post-closing. Buyer then has a claim against the seller. So those are the types of things that we try to really protect our clients from making reps and warranties that are, either that broad, that deep, or forward-looking where they can't say with any degree of certainty as of the closing, all of our AR is going to be collectible post-closing.
Those are good examples. Another topic we run into often is indemnification. So what protections can help mitigate risk regarding indemnification for the seller?
Absolutely. And so that gets back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. If a seller breaches one of the reps and warranties that it makes in a purchase agreement, the buyer has the ability to make a claim under the purchase agreement for that breach of that rep and warranty. The indemnification provision sets forth the parameters through which the buyer can recover from a seller as a result of the breach of that seller's rep and warranty. So basically, we try to put a number of different limitations on those on the sell side, most of which are very standard fare, and again goes back to kind of that first point of speaking the same language as a buyer's counsel is speaking in terms of what types of limitations on indemnity we'll be talking about. The details of those obviously get negotiated, but the types that you would typically think about: time limitation on reps and warranties. So you're making these reps and warranties as of closing. At some point, a seller has to be able to go to sleep and know that it doesn't have any lingering risk from this deal. So typically reps and warranties in a purchase agreement will quote unquote survive for 12, 18, 24 months, at which point if a buyer discovers a breach, it no longer has the ability to bring a claim against the seller. So obviously on the sell side, we want that period to be as short as possible. So that's kind of the first bucket of ways that we can limit exposure through the indemnity procedures. The other kind of two major items are what we call caps and baskets. So a basket basically says, we've closed this transaction, we've all spent a lot of time and money getting to a closing. A buyer shouldn't have the ability to come back and nickel and dime a seller to bring claims relating to, immaterial items. So if there's, a $5,000 copier lease that a seller didn't disclose, that a buyer didn't know about, a buyer shouldn't have the ability to make a formal indemnity claim under the purchase agreement for a $5,000 loss that it incurs. So a basket says, and the percent, it's typically determined as a percentage of the purchase price, and it will say, for the first, call it 1% of the losses as a percentage of the purchase price that a buyer incurs, you're on the hook for those. That's kind of ordinary course, cost of doing business, immaterial items. And so that's what we call a basket. And so once a buyer fills up that basket, the theory is then, okay, we've suffered some level of material losses as a result of this deal. We should now be able to have the ability to have recourse against the seller. Again, very customary setup. And then what we term a cap is that next layer of exposure. How much should the seller be on the hook for and still have comfort that it won't have to turn over 100% of the purchase price that it just received because of breaches of reps and warranties? So typically you'd have something, depending on deal size and some other factors, including whether a buyer has obtained rep and warranty insurance, something like 1-ish% of the purchase price as the buyer's basket that it has to incur, after which point the next 5, 10, 20% of the purchase price the seller would be on the hook for as a result of its breaches of reps and warranties. So from the sell side, to kind of put a bow on all of that, we would want the survival period for the reps and warranties to be as short as possible. We would want the buyer's basket to be as big as possible. And we would want the seller's cap, that next portion for which a seller would have liability, to be as small as possible.
That's a good summary. Thanks for that, Chris.
Absolutely.
Sum it up, hopefully everyone got a good overall picture of why bringing in an M&A attorney for a sell-side transaction is important. I know a lot of our sellers want to get to a letter of intent. They care about purchase price. They care about the fit. But we want to stress that getting the purchase agreement done the right way by an experienced M&A attorney, not only does the transaction, it sets up confidence with buyer and seller during the transaction, but it also allows our sellers to sleep at night post-close as well when they start doing other things, retiring, going on vacation, etc. So hopefully you found this video helpful, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Thanks. If you enjoy learning more about Calder Capital and our sell-side advisory practice, you can contact or find us on the details listed on the screen. We look forward to hearing from you soon.